The ROV's lights cut through 1,000 meters of black water somewhere northeast of Savo Island in the Solomon Islands. The cameras are streaming live. Scientists on the surface watch the monitor. Then metal appears out of the void. Massive gun turrets. A shattered bridge. Hull plating torn open like paper. This is the USS Vincennes, a heavy cruiser that sank in one of the worst naval defeats in American history, the Battle of Savo Island, August 1942. 322 men went down with her, and for more than 7 decades, she stayed hidden in a place they call Iron Bottom Sound, a graveyard holding more than 50 Allied and Japanese warships from World War II. The wreck was first found in 2015 during a sonar mapping expedition led by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen's team. But when the Ocean Exploration Trust's vessel Nautilus returned to survey her in July 2025, what they documented didn't match the story we'd been told. The damage was more extensive than anyone expected, and that raised a question nobody wanted to ask. What really happened on that bridge in the minutes before the attack? The wreck lies in approximately 500 fathoms, about 914 meters of water northeast of Savo Island, in the heart of what sailors call Iron Bottom Sound. The name isn't poetic, it's literal. The seabed there is carpeted in steel destroyers, cruisers, transports, cargo ships. American, Australian, Japanese, all sunk in a 6-month campaign that turned the waters around Guadalcanal into the most contested naval battlefield of the Pacific War. When Paul Allen's research team first located the Vincennes in 2015 using advanced sonar mapping technology, they confirmed the wreck's identity through distinctive New Orleans-class heavy cruiser design features. But it wasn't until July 2025, when the Ocean Exploration Trust deployed remotely operated vehicles, Hercules and Argus, from the research vessel Nautilus, that anyone got a clear look at what remained. The live-streamed footage came through in real time. Thousands of people around the world watched as the ROV descended through the water column, its lights barely penetrating the murk. The sonar painted a ghostly image on the screens, something large, angular, clearly man-made. Then the ROV's lights picked up the details. A hull broken into sections, gun turrets, some collapsed, others still recognizable. The bridge wreckage tilted at a severe angle, the stern section separated from the main hull, propellers half buried in volcanic sediment. Expedition leads on the Nautilus confirmed visual matches with New Orleans-class specifications. The distinctive triple 8-inch gun turrets, 2 mounted forward, 1 aft. The split superstructure that characterized American treaty cruisers. The damage was catastrophic. As the ROV moved closer, the details became sharper. The metal was covered in marine growth decades of coral, sponges, and algae, turning the wreck into an artificial reef. Fish darted in and out of what used to be gun ports. Sea anemones clung to twisted metal. But underneath all that life, you could still see the violence. Hull plating peeled back from torpedo impacts. Fire damage across the superstructure. Structural beams bent and twisted. What made this survey significant wasn't just documenting the wreck's current state, it was understanding how the physical evidence matched up with what survivors reported in 1942. Survivor accounts described chaos, fire, and rapid sinking, men jumping into burning oil slicks, explosions tearing through the superstructure, a ship going down in less than an hour, and in a battle the U.S. Navy lost in less than 40 minutes. A battle so catastrophic it's still studied in naval academies as a case study in failure. The wreck raised hard questions about what went wrong. The Vincennes had radar, newly installed just weeks before. She had experienced officers, many of them veterans of pre-war fleet exercises. She was part of a defensive screen specifically positioned to protect the Allied invasion fleet anchored off Guadalcanal. Her job was to detect threats and stop them. So how did a Japanese task force, 7 warships, moving in a column without radar, without air cover, without any technological advantage, get close enough to put torpedoes and shells into her before anyone could mount an effective defense? The expedition team documented the evidence. Navy historians reviewed the footage, but the wreck itself, sitting there in the dark, torn apart by shellfire and torpedoes, suggested that whatever happened on the night of August 8, 1942, was more complicated than the official reports ever admitted. There was another detail the ROV captured, something that told the story of how quickly it happened. On the starboard side of the hull, near the waterline, there were impact craters, deep, jagged holes punched through the steel, torpedo hits. The Japanese long-lance torpedoes that struck her were fired from long range, probably over 10,000 yards out, during the initial approach. By the time anyone on the Vincennes realized they were under attack, those torpedoes were already in the water. The wreck showed a ship that never had time to fight back the way she was designed to. The Vincennes wasn't sunk by bad luck. She was sunk by a catastrophic failure to recognize a Japanese task force closing in under cover of darkness. On the night of August 8, 1942, the Vincennes was part of Task Group 62.6, a screening force protecting the Allied invasion of Guadalcanal and Tulagi in the Solomon Islands. It was the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific after Pearl Harbor. Thousands of Marines had just landed on the beaches. Supplies were still being unloaded from transports anchored offshore, and the Navy's job was to stop the Japanese from interfering, to form a defensive perimeter and hold it. The Vincennes was positioned north of Savo Island, patrolling a line with the heavy cruisers USS Astoria and USS Quincy. Behind them, closer to the invasion beaches, were the transports vulnerable, slow-moving, packed with Marines and cargo. If the Japanese broke through the cruiser screen, the invasion would collapse. At approximately 1:43 a.m. on August 9th, Japanese Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's cruiser column, 7 warships moving in a tight line, opened fire. They'd approached from the northwest, slipping past patrol destroyers. The first indication most American ships had of the attack was when searchlights snapped on and shells started landing. Declassified battle damage reports described the Vincennes taking hits from 8-inch armor-piercing and high-explosive shells almost immediately. Fires erupted on the bridge. The foremast was hit early, collapsing the communications antennas and disrupting radio capabilities. Forward gun directors were knocked offline. Survivor testimonies recorded in the weeks after the battle described chaos. Officers scrambling to identify targets in the dark, gun crews trying to train turrets on enemies they could barely see, torpedoes cutting trails through the black water. The ship's captain, Frederick Reefcohl, was wounded during the engagement. Executive officers tried to coordinate damage control, but the hits kept coming. At least 2 Japanese long-lance oxygen-fueled torpedoes, some of the most effective naval weapons of the war, struck the starboard side. One hit forward, another hit amidships, near the aviation fuel tanks. Water poured in, fires spread. The ship began to list to starboard. The Vincennes did fire back. Multiple salvos were launched into the darkness, though in the confusion and without clear targets, few if any hits were scored. Gun crews fought their stations even as fires raged around them, but the damage was already catastrophic. By approximately 2:30 a.m., the list had become severe. Fires raged out of control across multiple decks. Ammunition was cooking off. The forward superstructure was engulfed in flames. The order was given to abandon ship. Men jumped into the water, many without life jackets. Some were pulled under. Others were picked up by destroyers hours later, burned, bleeding, exhausted. One survivor described floating in oil-slicked water, watching the Vincennes burn against the night sky before she disappeared. The Vincennes sank at approximately 2:50 a.m., slipping beneath the surface in water about 500 fathoms deep. Bodies were found floating in the debris field for days afterward. Some were buried at sea. Others were never found. What the wreck shows now matches that timeline. The ROV footage reveals torpedo impact craters on the starboard hull, deep, catastrophic breaches that would have flooded entire compartments rapidly. The engineering spaces show massive damage. The bridge area is collapsed, structural beams twisted from fire, and explosion damage. But here's what the wreck couldn't answer. Why weren't those radar contacts acted on earlier in the night? Survivor accounts and post-battle analysis indicate that radar contacts were detected, but there was confusion about their identity. Were they friendly ships? Weather interference? The volcanic island creating false returns? In 1942, radar was new technology. Officers were still learning to trust it, still learning to interpret what they were seeing on the screens. The contacts were noted but not immediately acted upon with the urgency the situation demanded. No general quarters was sounded until the Japanese were already opening fire. The ship remained at a lower state of readiness. Crews were exhausted from days at battle stations during the invasion. Officers made judgment calls with incomplete information. The wreck suggests the Vincennes and her crew never had the chance they needed. By the time the threat was recognized as real, the Japanese torpedoes were already running toward them through the dark water. And by the time the searchlights came on and shells started falling, it was already too late to mount an effective defense. The question that haunted investigators then, and still resonates now. Could better training on the new radar systems have made a difference? Could clearer communication protocols have saved her? The physical damage to the Vincennes shows exactly why the U.S. lost 4 cruisers in a single night. ROV mapping identified the torpedo strike's hits on the starboard side that punched through the hull plating with devastating effect. The Japanese long-lance torpedoes were fired from long range during the approach, probably over 10,000 yards out. They ran deep and fast with minimal wake signature. The Vincennes took at least 2 confirmed hits, possibly more. The hull plating around those impacts tells the story. It's thin, barely reinforced compared to later designs. The armor belt, the thickened steel designed to protect vital spaces, like magazines and engine rooms, was kept narrow and light to comply with Washington Naval Treaty limits. The treaty, signed in 1922, capped heavy cruisers at 10,000 tons displacement and 8-inch guns. It was meant to prevent an arms race after World War I. Instead, it forced naval architects to make impossible compromises: speed or armor, firepower or protection. You couldn't have both. The Vincennes chose speed and firepower. She could make over 32 knots at full steam, and her 8-inch guns could engage enemy cruisers at long range. But her armor was designed to resist destroyer-caliber shells at best. Against 8-inch cruiser rounds and long-lance torpedo warheads, it was inadequate. The wreck proves it. The hull plates are peeled back, edges curled outward from the force of the explosions and flooding. Compartments that should have been watertight were breached rapidly. The gun turrets show the chaos of the engagement. While the Vincennes did fire multiple salvos, survivor accounts and battle reports confirmed the fire was largely ineffective. In a night battle, without adequate illumination and with targets obscured by darkness and confusion, the gun crews were fighting at a severe disadvantage. Japanese ships used searchlights offensively, snapping them onto blind enemy crews and illuminate targets for their own gunners. It was a tactic refined through earlier engagements. American ships, trained in peacetime exercises where searchlights were considered primarily defensive tools, didn't employ them as aggressively. That tactical difference cost lives. Fire damage is concentrated around the superstructure. The likely causes: aviation fuel stored for the ship's float planes igniting when torpedoes struck, and fires spreading through the damaged structure. The Vincennes carried 2 Curtiss SOC Seagull scout planes on catapults amidships. The high-octane aviation gasoline stored for those planes was vulnerable. When the torpedoes hit and fires started, that fuel added to the inferno. The resulting fires spread through ventilation shafts, up ladders, into crew berthing spaces. Naval historians have debated for decades whether Savo Island was a failure of tactics, technology, or training. The wreck evidence supports the conclusion. It was all 3. The lack of adequate armor made her vulnerable. The confusion during the engagement prevented effective coordinated fire, and the new radar equipment, while installed and functional, wasn't fully trusted or properly interpreted by officers still learning how to use it in combat conditions. Experts reviewing the 2025 footage noted the extensive close-range shell damage to the superstructure. This confirms that Mikawa's ships closed to extremely close range a few thousand yards. During the engagement, the American ships had radar. The Japanese didn't, but the Japanese had better night-fighting tactics, better training for close-range combat in darkness, and the element of complete surprise. The damage patterns also show the effects of internal fires and flooding combining to doom the ship. Once the torpedoes breached the hull and fires started spreading, the Vincennes was fighting a losing battle against physics. Water flooding in, fires consuming oxygen, systems failing. The crew fought to save her, but the damage was too extensive. What the wreck makes clear is that this wasn't a fair fight. It was an ambush executed with precision against ships that weren't ready. The rediscovery and survey of the Vincennes didn't just document a wreck, it reopened questions about accountability, memory, and what we owe to those who die. The wreck is now protected as a war grave under U.S. Navy policy and agreements with the Solomon Islands. The ship remains U.S. property under international maritime law governing sunken warships, and Solomon Islands authorities recognize its status as a protected site. No salvage is permitted. No artifacts may be removed. No disturbance of the site is allowed beyond non-invasive survey work. That protection means the Vincennes and the 322 men still aboard her will remain where they fell. But it also means the wreck will continue to deteriorate. Saltwater corrosion, structural collapse, marine growth consuming the steel, Eventually, there will be nothing left but fragments scattered across the seafloor. Families of the lost crew have grappled with this reality for decades. Some were never officially listed as missing in action because bodies were recovered and buried at sea in the days after the battle. Others simply vanished, presumed dead when the ship went down. For these families, the wreck represents both a grave and a mystery, a place where their loved ones rest, but one they can never visit, never tend, never truly know. The debate over pre-battle intelligence continues to this day. Post-battle analysis and declassified documents reveal that there were detection failures and communication breakdowns throughout the American force that night. Radar contacts were noted but misidentified or dismissed. There was confusion about whether detected ships were friendly or enemy. Officers were exhausted from days of combat operations. The new radar systems were not yet fully integrated into tactical doctrine. Some historians argue the failure was structural, that the Navy's command structure in 1942 was too rigid, too reliant on peacetime procedures, too slow to adapt to the realities of modern naval combat in the Pacific. Information didn't flow efficiently. There was no clear doctrine for interpreting and acting on radar contacts in real-time combat situations. Officers were left making split-second decisions with incomplete information and insufficient training. Others argue it was fundamentally a human failure, fatigue, confusion, and the chaos of combat creating conditions where mistakes were inevitable. Officers who'd spent years in peacetime Navy suddenly found themselves in a new kind of warfare: night battles, radar technology, an enemy with superior night fighting tactics, and they weren't ready. The wreck doesn't resolve that debate, but it does add weight to the argument that the men aboard the Vincennes weren't given adequate preparation for the fight they faced. They had new technology but insufficient training to use it effectively under combat stress. They had intelligence capabilities but no clear doctrine for acting on fragmentary information. They had weapons but were caught by an enemy who understood night fighting better than they did. What makes the Vincennes matter now isn't just what happened in 1942. It's what the loss forced the Navy to change. After Savo Island, the Navy completely overhauled its night fighting tactics. Radar training became intensive and standardized. New doctrines for cruiser engagements were developed. Command structures were reorganized to allow faster decision-making in fluid combat situations. Communications protocols were improved. Searchlight tactics were revised. Those changes helped win the Pacific War, but they came too late for the Vincennes, too late for the Astoria, the Quincy, HMAS Canberra, too late for the 1,077 Allied sailors who died that night in Iron Bottom Sound. The wreck sits in cold, dark water, slowly corroding, while the lessons it taught continue to shape naval doctrine. The 2025 survey documented the current state of the hull, the extent of the damage, the way marine life has colonized the steel. Fish swarm around the wreckage. Coral grows on the gun turrets. Life has claimed the ship in a way death never fully could. But the survey also left questions unanswered. There are spaces on the wreck that the ROVs couldn't fully access. Collapsed compartments, debris-blocked passageways, areas too dangerous or too restricted to penetrate. What's in those spaces? Personal belongings, probably. Equipment, possibly remains that were never recovered. The expedition team chose not to force access, out of respect for the dead and in compliance with war grave protocols. Some questions don't need answers. Some spaces should remain undisturbed, but one question won't go away. If the officers on watch that night had trusted what the radar was showing them, if they had sounded general quarters when those first contacts appeared, would the outcome have been different? Would 322 men have gone home instead of to the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound? We'll never know. The men who could answer that question died with the ship. What we do know is this: the Vincennes and her crew did their duty as they understood it, with the training and tools they'd been given. They fought when the attack came. They died trying to defend the Marines on those beaches and the ships in that anchorage. The wreck will stay there, a monument not to failure, but to the cost of learning how to fight a war nobody was ready for, until the ocean finally reclaims it completely, until the steel dissolves and there's nothing left but sediment and memory. And maybe that's the only memorial they need, not a plaque in a museum or a monument on some distant shore, but the cold, dark silence of the deep, where the only witnesses are time and the sea. But one question nobody's answered yet: what was in the spaces the cameras couldn't reach?